In this episode of Flying Through Time, we'll take a flying trip through the years of the development of the American heavy bomber. These planes were the big stick wielded by the US offensive forces and became the tools of choice in the brinkmanship of the Cold War. Today, they're the platforms for launching military surgery and the embodiment of US air power. The experiences of the First World War had allowed for the new technology of air power to become an important tool in the trade of conflict. The American general Billy Mitchell saw the aircraft as an important part of any defense strategy in any conflicts to come. Perhaps with astounding foresight, he determined that the outcome of these wars would hinge on obtaining air superiority. However, these concepts would eventually cost him his position, as they flew in the face of the current administration and all naval ideas of the time. Sea power had been the yardstick by which all battles were governed at that time, and they envisioned that air power would inevitably encroach on naval objectives. As proof of his ideas about the ascendancy of air power, the sinking of the German war prize battleship Ostfriesland polarized the Navy and Army air power establishments and eventually led to his removal from office. In the early 30s, very swift technology advancements soon swept from the World War I biplanes and into metal monoplanes. Boeing's B-1 was one of the most successful of the era. However, funding was always small, primarily because the range of the existing planes limited their effectiveness, and the Navy was seen to be the defender of the nation. The B-9 and subsequent B-10 were huge advances, but the then administration was still leaning to naval concerns and attitudes for the defense of the nation. In 1933, however, the Army contracted for a plane to carry a ton of bombs over 5,000 miles, thereby belaying naval concerns by allowing enough range to attack countries, not only maritime targets. Boeing again won the contract with their XB-15, which in 1936 led to the further advanced XB-19 in 1941 with a wingspan of 219 feet. These were more experimental aircraft, though, than actual concepts of bombers. The lessons learnt on these aircraft allowed for many more subsequent advances. However, on June 18, 1934, Boeing began work on another design, their Model 299. Its first flight in 1935 proved to everyone that this was not just another concept. This design was outstanding and obviously the shape of things to come. This plane would go on to become the B-17 Flying Fortress. The 299 was still, though, not without controversy. During contract evaluation, the only example was destroyed in an accident, and the manufacturing orders were placed for the rival Douglas B-18, though it was an obviously outdated model derived from the DC-2. The increasing tensions in Europe and the huge potential of the 299 saw test orders placed in 1936. This also allowed for significant upgrades, and the YB-17A went on to over 10,000 hours of trouble-free testing. During the same era, Consolidated had been building PB-5Y flying boats for the Navy, using their patented new Davis aerofoil wing. Using the new wing's outstanding performance and the deep-sided fuselage of the flying boat, the new Model 32 was designed. This was again another huge technology leap and would be known as the B-24 Liberator. September of 1939 saw tensions finally break in Europe and war declared. Both models were delivered into the theatre, though with the Liberators in higher numbers. Further refinement of the new bombers went on for the next 2 years, and when the US was dragged into the war by the attack on Pearl Harbor at the close of 1941, the B-17Es and B-24Cs were available for deployment. For the next 3 years, huge numbers of both planes were delivered and lost in the arenas. The concepts of high-altitude daylight bombing saw more upgrades in armament and armor, and particularly in tactics. The 17s truly earned their name Flying Fortress with waist guns, ball turrets, new tail guns and nose guns. The theory was that massed box formations would be able to defend themselves against the impressive Axis fighters. However, the losses in crews and aircraft were staggering. After a mission against Axis fighters and increasingly accurate flak, many crews owed their lives to the engineered toughness of these planes in their limping returns to Allied bases. The daylight bombing offensive was nearly abandoned a number of times, and it wasn't until later escort fighters in the form of P-47s, P-38s and P-51s, all with drop tanks for added range, that the attrition rate was actually slowed and the tide began to turn. Also during this period, German U-boats were cutting swathes through the Axis supply convoys. It wasn't until the introduction of the B-24 and its increased range that the 300-mile U-boat alley in the middle of the Atlantic could actually be protected. At times before the Liberator, the losses in ships and cargo were almost unsustainable, and the balance of the European war had hung by a thread. The Pacific theater's huge distances created another requirement for the US Air Force. With the lack of land bases, the offensive couldn't effectively be taken to the Imperial Japanese forces. During the early months of 1942, American confidence had taken a battering after the crushing blow of Pearl Harbor, and defeat after defeat having been suffered in the Pacific. A bold attack was carried out in an attempt to shore up morale on the home front. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchells, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, took off from the carrier Hornet. They headed for Japan, which was over 700 miles away. The Mitchells successfully bombed targets in Kobe, Yokohama and Nagoya, as well as Tokyo, and no aircraft were lost over the target, though all 16 B-25s that took part in the mission were lost. The attack highlighted the need for a new, longer-range heavy bomber. The lessons learned from Boeing's XB-19 Giant stood in good stead for the new contract, which would be fought out between Consolidated's B-32 Dominator and Boeing's Model 345 B-29. The Dominator was seen to be a marginal advancement on current technology, whereas the B-29 was absolute cutting edge. The Boeing plane was given the contract, but hedging their bets, the Air Force also funded testing of the B-32 in case the Super Fortress, with all its new features, failed to live up to expectations. The testing of the B-29 began in mid-1942 and proceeded for the next 12 months. However, it wasn't until the capture of the Mariana Islands that the offensive could actually be taken to Japan itself. Daylight raids produced mixed results, and it wasn't until the LeMay treatment began and the use of firebombing that any real progress resumed. The attrition, while not to early European standards, was still substantial. During one night, the results from one raid showed Tokyo glowing from 40 miles away and produced the most destructive results ever dealt during a war. 16 square miles, nearly 25% of Tokyo was flattened, 150,000 people missing, injured or killed, and over 1 million homeless. One B-29 will be remembered above all others. During July 1945, the US tested their first operational atomic weapon. 1 month later, a superfortress would carry the 10,000-pound bomb to Hiroshima. 4.5 square miles of the city and almost 80,000 occupants disappeared. The Enola Gay B-29 is still today the most destructive weapon ever used. The closing part of World War II saw English and German developments in new jet engines. These would soon make the concept of massed formations of huge, slow bombers antiquated. Unless the US could match the new engine's performances, a newfound air dominance would soon be threatened. In 1944, the US Air Force issued a contract for a new jet bomber concept, and a number of concepts were tabled. The consolidated B-36 had been in development since 1941 and was rolled out only days after Japan surrendered, and the groundbreaking B-35 flying wing from Northrop with its tailless pusher-prop design was also entered. Another was the B-50 from Boeing, in reality a higher-powered version of their outstanding B-29 that had been enhanced by the new concept of in-flight refueling. Northrop also re-entered the contest with their YB-49, a jet version of their flying wing. Unfortunately, this concept seemed to be too far ahead of its time. The new plane contract was awarded to the B-36 Peacemaker after the addition of the pod-mounted jets concept of Boeing's B-47 Stratojet to increase the plane's performance. The US bombers were now entering the jet age. The shadow of the Cold War began in June of 1948 with the Soviet closing of Berlin, and the future of the Peacemaker seemed assured. The B-36 was actually the most heavily defended aircraft ever, though in comparison to B-17s and B-24s bristling with machine guns, the 36 seemed almost defenseless. The armament was supplied by 6 raisable, remotely controlled turrets with twin 20mm cannons. These, when combined with the nose and tail cannons, provided automated fire control for over 1.5 miles in all approaches. In 1949, the Soviets displayed the swept-wing jet fighter MiG-15 at their May Day celebration, and a collective shudder went through the US Strategic Air Command. And the replacement of the Peacemaker, which had been happening in the background since 1946, was now turned up another notch. Consolidated, now Convair, introduced the YB-60 concept, in reality a B-36 with swept wings and all-jet propulsion. The Air Force, though, considered that the 36 had seen its day and was in favor of the new Boeing B-52 and contracted for production in February of 1951. The test plane can be seen here with one of Boeing's original B-17 Fortresses. In August of 1954, the last B-36 Peacemaker rolled from Convair's production plant, and the Air Force was set to embrace their all-new, all-jet heavy bomber. The prototypes of the Stratofortress were delivered for testing in March 1952. The first test flight with Boeing test pilot A.M. Tex Johnson and Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Guy M. Townsend at the controls reported that the YB-52 was a hell of a good airplane. One of the top secret features of the plane was its steerable undercarriage, which always pointed forward in spite of crabbing during takeoff and landings. The B models went into full production. However, the performance of the plane showed problems in other areas of the Air Force's stable. Air tankers at the time were all prop-driven, and their top speed was only marginally above that of the stall speed of the Stratofortress. This was later cured with the all-jet tankers also provided by Boeing, as the KC-135. In the early 1960s, a new menace raised its head and threatened the concept of large, high-flying bombers. New advances in ground-to-air and air-to-air missilery and the concept of intercontinental ballistic weapons threatened to cut short the B-52's service. Minuteman and Polaris missiles removed the need for the stratofortresses. However, the saber-rattling and brinkmanship of the Cold War, where opposing forces could be flown to within sight of each other or to the edge of foreign airspace before the command to launch a nuclear war was given, allowed for a small but necessary gap for sanity to prevail. The new ICBMs provided none of the necessary last-minute negotiations after their launch. Fortunately, B-52s provided with the new Hound Dog standoff missiles gave back this narrow but definitely necessary window of opportunity to the statesmen of both countries. The mission could be flown along the edge of foreign airspace, signifying their intentions, but allowing for the ability of flexible negotiation skills. Other developments along the same vein were the quail decoys used to mimic the radar signatures of a B-52 and the Schramm missiles, carried in greater numbers and which could be guided from the plane with excellent accuracy up to 100 miles away. In 1965, SAC's B-52s were used dramatically in Vietnam. Carrying 108 500-pound iron bombs, these raids throughout the conflict eventually were to force the negotiations for peace during the Linebacker II missions. By the late 1960s, many of the older B-52 variants were nearing the end of their careers, and the Air Force had envisaged a replacement in the new XB-70 Valkyrie on the edge of new groundbreaking technologies. This bomber's design was to fly at or beyond 3 times the speed of sound at extreme altitudes, well beyond even the detection systems of the enemy. As ICBM technology grew, the XB-70 suffered from huge cost overruns and a cooling of political will to develop it. A crash of one of the 2 test models saw the program shelved, and the B-52 went on to further development. By 1978, the B-52Fs were also forced to be removed from service as they began to reach the end of their airframe service lives. However, this time, Rockwell's new B-1A Lancer was seen to be a replacement. But again, the Carter administration frowned on ever-increasing costs, and the project was shelved in favor of the cheaper costs of cruise missiles delivered from ships and B-52s. So again, the bomber was saved and kept in development. The development of air-launched cruise missiles, or ALCMs, kept the Stratofortress on the cutting edge of the American military might. By this time, the B-52s were entering their G and then onto the H models. In 1983, the Reagan administration, in a drive on military buildup, restarted the B-1 program, and the B-1B was born, though this time in a different role. Only half of the original speed was required, but extensive stealth technologies were provided. Also, only 100 of these planes were to be ordered, and so the B-52s were again retained in their heavy bombing and cruise missile super platform roles. In 1988, a vision of the past miraculously reappeared. The original XB-35 and YB-49 began as a heavy bomber concept. Uniquely, the Northrop flying wing concepts 30 years before had uncomfortably disappeared from radar screen on occasion. Again, the Northrop Company had rebirthed the concept as the B-2 Spirit, an almost undetectable stealth bomber capable of delivering standard cruise and nuclear munitions almost anywhere in the world. The B-2 is certainly more than capable of replacing the aging Stratofortress in almost all of its roles. However, it does have one drawback. This is the most expensive plane ever built, and consequently in today's monetary climate, it's doubtful that the Spirit will reach the numbers to fully replace America's aging B-52s, so again, they continue. Interestingly, current conflicts are seeing the B-52 still flying in all of their awesome power, but the crews who man the aircraft are actually younger than the masterpiece that they're flying. Eventually, age will have to catch up with the Stratofortress, and what their true replacement will be, if any, only time will tell. This has been another adventure in Flying Through Time. Join us again next time when we cast our eyes over the ever-broadening realm of flight.